Right now, an AI in a server farm is writing a story about a mafia boss falling in love. It's testing 11,000 variations, and it knows, with chilling precision, which one you will click. This isn't fiction. It's a psychological operation running on every screen, exploiting a flaw in your brain you cannot control. This genre, mafia romance, now commands a billion-dollar digital empire built on a specific recipe: a hardened criminal, an innocent woman, and a vulnerable child or animal. It works because it exploits a neurological shortcut, hijacking our empathy before reason can intervene. But behind every viral story about a mob boss and a kitten, there is a real shelter, a real single mother, and a very real cost. The question is no longer why we click, but what happens when an entire culture is trained by the click. To understand the factory, you must meet its architects. They don't work in publishing houses. They work in content farms, where teams of writers and AI tools are given a simple mandate: produce narratives that trigger the highest measurable emotional response. The most successful template is codified in a brief known internally as the redemption equation. It requires three elements: a morally gray alpha male with wealth and power, a financially vulnerable but morally pure female lead, and a defenseless dependent: a child, a puppy, a kitten. The kitten, research shows, is optimal, especially if it is injured or disabled. The one-eyed kitten in our story is not an artistic choice. It is a calculated variable. The process is not creative. It is surgical. AI analyzes thousands of top-performing stories across platforms like Wattpad and Amazon Kindle Direct. It isolates beats: the meet cute, the threat, the protective act, the softening. Human writers then assemble these beats, but the core emotional payload is engineered. The goal is to bypass the prefrontal cortex, the brain's reasoning center, and speak directly to the limbic system, where empathy and fear live. This is why the headlines feel irresistible. The mafia boss's virgin, saved by the billionaire bull, his broken kitten. Your rational mind may dismiss it, but your amygdala has already been triggered. You have already felt the ping of concern, the glow of a rescue fantasy. The click is a formality. This content farm ecosystem is vast and largely invisible. It operates on a churn and burn model, publishing thousands of titles monthly, often under dozens of pen names. Success is measured not in literary reviews, but in read-through rates and algorithm favor. The stories are priced cheaply or offered through subscription services like Kindle Unlimited, where payment is based on pages read. The faster and harder the emotional hooks, the more pages are consumed. The more pages consumed, the more the platform's algorithm promotes the story, creating a feedback loop of increasingly extreme narratives. This is how a niche fantasy became a billion-dollar segment of the publishing industry. It is a perfect, amoral machine optimized for one thing: neurological engagement. But every machine needs raw material. The fantasy draws its power from real-world anxieties and real-world struggles. Enter the second key player, the animal shelter system. In 2021, 355,000 dogs and cats were killed in American shelters for lack of space or resources. The animals most at risk are the ones that need the most help: the seniors, the sick, the disabled, the one-eyed kittens. Shelters are often underfunded, understaffed, and overwhelmed by a constant influx of abandoned pets. Their staff experiences burnout at rates comparable to first responders. This is a system in genuine crisis, operating on the fraying edge of compassion. This crisis creates a powerful, exploitable emotional backdrop. The viral story of the single mom running a shelter from her garage works because it mirrors a painful truth. Many rescues are heroically run by individuals on the brink of financial collapse, surviving on thin streams of donations. The narrative weaponizes this reality. It takes the image of a struggling caregiver, a figure who deserves genuine support, and places her opposite a fictional villain who is also a fictional savior: the mafia boss. He represents both the danger of the world and the fantasy of limitless resources to combat it. He is the problem and the fairy tale solution. This narrative sleight of hand is devastatingly effective. It offers catharsis without complexity. It promises that systemic failure can be solved by one powerful man's change of heart, often signaled by his wallet. Audiences are not naive. Many understand they are consuming a fantasy, but the constant consumption reshapes perception. When the most visible, most shared stories about animal rescue involve dramatic, criminal-led rescues, it subtly reframes what rescue means. The quiet, unglamorous work of daily care, fundraising, and adoption counseling fades. The expectation becomes drama, transformation, and romantic payoff. This has a tangible effect. Shelter workers report potential adopters coming in with references to these stories, sometimes disappointed by the mundane reality. More insidiously, the tropes can influence which animals get attention. The special needs animal in a story is a prop for a character's redemption. In a real shelter, that animal requires expensive, lifelong care that few adopters are prepared for. The fantasy can inadvertently create a mismatch, setting up both animal and adopter for failure. The final ingredient in this ecosystem is you, the consumer. The brain's science is clear. Emotional content is processed 250 milliseconds before rational content. The clickbait headline, the thumbnail with the tearful child and the kitten, creates what neurologists call an itch factory. A curiosity gap is opened. What happens to the kitten? Does the mobster change? And the brain seeks cognitive closure. It is a physiological urge. The platforms have turned this urge into a currency. Every click, every minute of watch time, every share is a data point that trains the algorithm to seek more potent versions of the same stimulus. You are both the customer and the product. Your emotional responses harvested to refine the very mechanism that manipulates you. We now have all the components of a perfect, self-sustaining loop. The content farms produce the engineered fantasy. The fantasy exploits the imagery of real shelter crises. The platforms amplify the most emotionally charged versions. And our own neurology compels us to complete the circuit, providing the engagement that justifies the entire operation. It is a closed system, seemingly without an exit. But what happens when the fiction bleeds into the operational reality of the very systems it uses as a backdrop? What happens when the demand for a certain kind of story, the dramatic rescue, the villain's redemption, starts to influence decisions made in the real world? The first concrete signal appeared not in a publishing report, but in adoption coordinator emails and shelter meeting notes. A pattern emerged of adopters specifically requesting special needs animals after binge-reading Mafia romance series. At first, this seemed like a positive. These were hard-to-place animals getting attention, but the follow-up data told a darker story. Return rates for these animals began to climb. The adopters, inspired by the fantasy of saving a broken creature as a romantic gesture, were often unprepared for the medical routines, the costs, the lack of a dramatic, transformative payoff. The animal, having finally found a home, was traumatized all over again by being returned. The fantasy narrative, designed to trigger empathy, was ultimately generating harm. The algorithm was now indirectly shaping life and death outcomes in kennels across the country. And the architects of the fantasy, the content farms, were about to make their boldest move yet, one that would target the single mother at the heart of the trope, not as a character, but as a consumer. The move was not more stories, it was a product line. The content farms, in partnership with direct-to-consumer brands, launched a series of curated romance subscription boxes. For a monthly fee, subscribers would receive a themed box, a scented candle named His Dangerous Promise, a blanket labeled Mafia's Embrace, a cheap piece of jewelry called The Boss's Claim, and a plush one-eyed kitten. The target demographic, identified by the same algorithms that shaped the stories, was women aged 25 to 45, with a significant overlap in data points indicating financial stress and a history of charitable donations to animal causes. The single mother archetype from the stories was now the ideal customer in real life. The fantasy was being packaged and sold back to those who most closely resembled the vulnerable heroine, turning empathy into a revenue stream. The emotional click was now a physical commitment, a box arriving monthly, each item a tactile reinforcement of the narrative loop. This monetization revealed the second layer of the operation. The stories were not the end product. They were the lead generator for a lifestyle brand. Reader groups on social media became targeted marketplaces. A post weeping over a fictional shelter's struggle would be followed by an ad for the subscription box, with a percentage donated to animal rescues. The donations were real, but minuscule, often a fraction of a percent of the sale. The rescue became a marketing tool, its image of struggle used to sell a fantasy version of its own salvation. For a real shelter operator like Maria Gonzalez, who ran Whisker Haven out of a converted garage in Arizona, the phenomenon was surreal. She began to see her own life reflected in the plots of the very books her volunteers sometimes read. The clutter of crates, the constant worry over funds, the desperate hope for a miracle donor. But the miracle in the stories was always a man, a dangerous, wealthy man who solved everything with a wave of his hand. In Maria's reality, the only thing that arrived was another box of abandoned kittens and a social media notification that her shelter's photo had been used, without permission, in an ad for one of those subscription services. The backlash from the shelter community was swift but fragmented. Some smaller rescues, desperate for any funding, accepted partnerships with the content farms, offering naming rights to litters of kittens in exchange for donations. A litter might be dubbed the Romano Rescues, each kitten named after a character from a popular series. It drove adoption interest, but it also fundamentally changed the narrative. The animals were no longer individuals with needs, they were storytelling props. The adopters they attracted were sometimes more invested in the fantasy than the reality of pet ownership. This was the harmful pattern beginning to crystallize. The engineered narrative was actively distorting the adoption ecosystem, creating demand based on fiction and setting up real animals for failure. Then came the incident that made the abstract concrete. A shelter in Oregon, Pause and Promise, participated in a major promotional event with a large content farm. The farm's most popular author did a live reading with specific, adoptable special needs cats as the emotional backdrop. The event raised $20,000, a windfall for the shelter, but it came with conditions. The Content Farm's marketing team demanded control over the imagery, the storytelling, and the adoption process for those featured cats. They scripted the shelter's social media posts, insisting on language that mirrored their book blurbs. This scared little Tabby is waiting for her billionaire savior. Could it be you? The cats were adopted quickly. Within 3 months, 4 of the 5 were returned. The adopters' interview responses revealed felt overwhelmed. They had been sold a story of transformative rescue, but they were unprepared for the daily medical care, the behavioral issues, the unglamorous work of love. The fantasy had set an impossible standard. The shelter, though financially helped in the short term, was left with traumatized animals and a deepening cynicism about the cost of such partnerships. This incident sparked the first organized resistance. A coalition of shelter directors, led by Maria Gonzalez, began documenting these cases. They collected data on return rates linked to narratively driven adoptions. They shared stories of adopters quoting Mafia romance plots during interviews. They argued that they were fighting not just for resources, but for the integrity of their mission. Their slogan was simple: "We are not a plot device." They launched a campaign to educate their supporters about the difference between fictional rescue and the complex, long-term work of actual animal welfare. They urged people to donate directly, to volunteer, to foster, to engage with the reality, not the fantasy. For a moment, it seemed like a grassroots correction was possible. The real experts, the ones in the trenches, were pushing back against the algorithmic distortion of their life's work. The content farms did not see a correction. They saw a marketing problem. Their internal data showed the Shelter Coalition's campaign was gaining traction in niche online communities. Engagement metrics on posts that used traditional, guilt-based shelter imagery were dipping slightly. This was interpreted not as an ethical critique, but as a shift in consumer emotional triggers. The narrative needed updating. If the struggling shelter trope was losing potency due to real-world backlash, the trope needed to evolve. The next generation of stories began to feature a new archetype, the feisty, independent shelter owner, who initially rejects the powerful man's help, only to be won over by his respect for her expertise. It was a narrative co-option of the very resistance forming against it. The story absorbed the critique and neutralized it by making it part of the romantic tension. The algorithm adapted, and the machine learned. The coalition's second move was to go on the offensive. They decided to create their own content. Maria Gonzalez started a vlog, The Real Garage, showing the unvarnished truth, the endless cleaning, the heartbreaking decisions, the joy of a successful adoption after months of work, the quiet moments of a cat simply purring. It was honest, raw, and at first it struggled for visibility. The platform's algorithms, optimized for high arousal emotions, did not prioritize its calm authenticity. Then they changed tactics. They used the language of the enemy. One video title was, "The Day a Real-Life Mafia Boss Walked Into My Shelter." The thumbnail showed a stern-looking man in a suit, actually a local businessman and donor, holding a kitten. The video itself was a straightforward account of a generous donation, devoid of drama or romance. But the hook worked. Views skyrocketed. The algorithm promoted it because it looked like the content it was trained to promote. The Shelter Coalition had discovered a dangerous tool, algorithmic camouflage. They could use the clickbait format to deliver a non-fictional, substantive message. It felt like a hack, a way to beat the machine at its own game. The content farms detected this incursion immediately. Their analytics flagged The Real Garage as a competing narrative entity. More importantly, it was a narrative they did not control. The story was not adhering to the redemption equation. There was no romantic payoff, no dramatic takeover. The powerful man remained just a donor. The shelter owner remained in charge. This was a threat to the formula. If audiences became engaged with a more complex, less fantasy-driven version of the shelter narrative, it could dilute the potency of the engineered product. The farms launched a two-pronged response. First, they amplified their own parallel content. They sponsored shelter makeover videos by influencers, where a wealthy benefactor, often an actor playing a mysterious CEO, would surprise a struggling rescue with a flashy renovation. The narrative beats were identical to their fiction. The rescue in distress, the powerful savior, the emotional transformation. These videos, professionally produced and heavily promoted, drowned out the quieter, real vlogs. Second prong was more insidious. They began a whisper campaign. In comment sections of Maria's videos, new accounts appeared. They questioned her management of funds. They suggested the real story was that she was misusing donations. They pointed to the businessman donor and insinuated, using the coded language of romance novels, that there must be a personal relationship influencing his charity. They were applying the tropes of their own stories, the corruption, the hidden secrets, to undermine reality. The goal was to reframe Maria not as a legitimate voice, but as a character in a different, seedier kind of story. This was the pivot. The narrative machine, when challenged, didn't argue facts. It weaponized storytelling itself to dismantle credibility. It tried to turn Maria Gonzalez into a plot twist. The pressure was no longer just about adoption returns or misleading partnerships. It was a direct attack on the truth-teller's character, engineered by the very fiction she opposed. The bridge to the next phase was not built on data, but on disinformation, and the coalition was about to learn that fighting a story required more than facts. It required an even more compelling counter-narrative. The Whisper campaign was just the probe. The real attack was a legal letter. A content farm's parent corporation, a media conglomerate, sent a cease and desist notice to Maria Gonzalez and the Real Garage Coalition. The claim was trademark infringement. They argued that by titling her video, "The Day a Real-Life Mafia Boss Walked Into My Shelter," Maria had unlawfully used a phrase and character archetype central to their branded intellectual property. They cited registered trademarks for series titles like Mafia Boss's Redemption and The Boss's Claim. The message was clear and brutal. The fiction claimed ownership over the language of reality. Maria was not being sued for slander or defamation, but for telling her own true story in words that a corporation had decided it owned. The legal threat was designed to do what the rumors could not: silence her with the crushing weight of legal fees and process. The coalition was thrown into disarray. They had no budget for a legal fight. Their strategy of algorithmic camouflage had backfired spectacularly, painting a target on them. This was the "wait, it gets worse" moment. The narrative machine was not just distorting reality, it was attempting to legally annex it. If a corporation could trademark the archetype of a wealthy man helping a vulnerable woman with an animal, what stopped them from claiming ownership over the very concept of a shelter rescue story? The implications extended far beyond animal welfare. It was a case study in how fictional narratives, when scaled and monetized to this degree, could be weaponized to control public discourse and stifle nonfiction truth-tellers. Maria's response was to go public with the letter. She posted it in full with a calm, detailed video explaining the situation. She did not use clickbait titles. She called it, "A Corporation Says It Owns My Life Story." This time, the algorithm was not the primary target. The video was a direct appeal to human journalists and legal observers. It worked. The story was picked up by independent news outlets, then by larger platforms. The framing was irresistible. Little Shelter sued by romance novel giant. The public sympathy swung violently in Maria's favor. Donations flooded in, many with notes telling her to fight. Pro bono legal offers arrived from advocacy groups focused on digital rights and free speech. The content farm had overplayed its hand. Their legal bullying had created a Streisand effect, amplifying Maria's message 100-fold. But the conglomerate was not foolish. They withdrew the lawsuit within 72 hours, issuing a bland statement calling it a misunderstanding and a routine protective measure. It was a tactical retreat, not a surrender. The damage to their brand was minimal. Their core audience of fiction consumers barely noticed the news. The damage to the Shelter Coalition, however, was psychological. They now understood the rules of engagement had changed. This was not a debate about adoption ethics. It was an asymmetrical conflict where one side had near limitless legal and financial resources to enforce narrative control. The coalition's morale, which had been buoyed by their initial viral success, crashed. The energy required to constantly fight a hydra of disinformation and legal threats was unsustainable for volunteers already burning out from their primary work. It was at this low point that a new player entered the scene, one that would reframe the entire conflict. A data analyst and former Content Farm employee using the pseudonym Algo Whisper reached out to Maria. This person had worked on the optimization teams, training the AI on emotional triggers. Burnt out and ethically conflicted, they provided a data dump, internal reports, A/B testing results, and audience segmentation profiles. The documents were a horrifying map of manipulation. They showed that the shelter crisis trope had been quantitatively validated through micro-testing. Different images of distressed animals were paired with different male character descriptions. The highest engagement came from the pairing of a one-eyed kitten with a character described as criminal but protective. The data was granular. The ideal age range for the fictional single mother, the exact income bracket that elicited the most donations in follow-up ads, the proof that adding a child to the narrative increased share rates by 37%. This was not intuition, it was emotional engineering. The most explosive revelation, however, was about data sourcing. To train these models, the content farms didn't just use other fiction. They scraped millions of public social media posts from real shelter pages, support groups for single mothers, and online donation forums. They used this real human pain and generosity as training data to create more effective fictional simulations. Your compassion had been mined to build a better trap for it. The algorithm learned what made you care by studying when real people cared, then fictionalized those triggers to hijack the same neurological pathways. The shelter's own posts about a difficult rescue had been fed into the machine that would later create a competing, simplified fantasy about that very scenario. Armed with this insider data, the coalition's strategy shifted from defense to systemic exposure. They partnered with digital ethicists and journalists to publish a series of reports titled The Empathy Algorithm. They framed the issue not as bad stories, but as weaponized narrative, a form of digital pollution that degraded the information ecosystem and exploited vulnerable communities. They stopped asking people to boycott the books. Instead, they asked a more profound question. Can you trust your own empathy if it has been deliberately triggered by a machine trained on stolen sorrow? The content farm's countermove to this exposure was the final, darkest escalation. They launched a new product line, blurring the line between fiction and reality completely. It was called live-action romance. In partnership with a streaming platform, they would produce short, documentary-style videos. The pitch: real shelters, real single mothers, real animals. But the stories would be curated and lightly dramatized. A filmmaker would follow a shelter, and the narrative would be shaped in post-production to fit the redemption equation. The struggling single mother would be presented with a surprise benefactor, an actor playing a wealthy businessman. The emotional beats would be guided, the dialogue suggested, the resolution crafted. They were not making fiction look real anymore. They were paying to make reality look like fiction. They offered shelters $15,000 to participate, a sum that to many was a year's worth of food and medical supplies. This created an agonizing schism within the animal rescue community. Some shelters, facing euthanasia lists due to overcrowding and empty bank accounts, saw the offer as a lifeline. They argued that if the story brought in donations and adoptions, even through a staged narrative, the ends justified the means. The animals would be helped. Others, led by Maria's coalition, saw it as the ultimate corruption. It would make the shelters complicit in their own exploitation, turning their genuine struggle into a reality TV trope. The debate tore through online forums and rescue networks. The content farm had successfully externalized its conflict, turning the shelters against each other in a fight over the price of their own authenticity. The machine had learned that if you can't defeat a truth-teller, you can tempt her peers, fracturing the resistance from within. As the live-action romance pilot episodes began filming, a new, more disturbing pattern emerged in the data AlgoWhisper provided. The segmentation profiles showed the farms were now specifically targeting two overlapping demographic groups: women who had recently undergone traumatic life events, divorce, job loss, and women in caretaker roles reporting high stress. The stories were being marketed as emotional refuge. The internal memos discussed optimizing for cathartic dependency, creating a story loop so reliably satisfying that readers would binge entire series, using the fictional redemption as a form of emotional regulation. This wasn't just selling fantasy. It was potentially exploiting psychological vulnerability, creating a feedback loop where real emotional need drove consumption, which in turn amplified the need for the simplistic resolution only the fiction could provide. The narrative machine was no longer just distorting shelter adoptions. It was feeding on real human emotional crisis, offering a counterfeit solution. The coalition stood at a precipice. Legal threats had been faced down. A public relations battle was being fought. But this new phase was different. It involved the active, paid manipulation of reality itself and the targeted exploitation of emotional distress. Fighting required more than exposure. It required a positive, equally compelling vision of what authentic connection and rescue looked like. They needed to build a narrative immune system. The transition to the final act began not with another attack, but with a realization. The only way to defeat a story that had become a system was to build a better, truer system in its place. The fight was about to move from the comment sections and legal documents to the very architecture of how stories are told and communities are built online. The weapon had been identified. Now, they had to learn how to dismantle it without becoming what they fought. The coalition's new system was not a platform. It was a protocol. They called it verified context. Built with the help of pro bono coders and the whistleblower data, it was a simple browser plugin and social media overlay. When installed, it worked in the background. If a user encountered a story, video, or ad using common rescue tropes, the struggling single mother, the wealthy savior, the disabled animal, the plugin would quietly scan the page. If it detected markers of a known content farm or a narrative pattern matching the redemption equation, a small, unobtrusive icon would appear in the corner of the screen. Clicking it did not block the content. Instead, it opened a sidebar with verified, contextual information. A story about a garage shelter would show links to real local rescues and their actual donation needs. A video featuring a special needs kitten would display data on the true costs and commitments of adopting an animal with those conditions. It was not censorship. It was immunization. It added the layer of complexity that the fictional narrative deliberately stripped away, re-injecting reality at the point of consumption. The launch was strategically quiet, targeting the very online communities where the content farms recruited their shelter influencer partners. The initial response was telling. Many users expressed relief. The constant, low-grade anxiety of clicking on emotional content, "Am I being manipulated? Is this real?" was alleviated. The plugin offered a way to satisfy the empathetic itch while redirecting that energy toward actionable, truthful engagement. Donation links in the sidebar, linked directly to the shelters mentioned, saw a significant uptick. The coalition had learned the final lesson. You cannot defeat an algorithm with morality. You must defeat it with a better algorithm. Verified context used the same principles of immediate, seamless user experience that made the clickbait effective, but in service of factual empowerment. The content farm's reaction was not immediate public confrontation. Their internal dashboards, however, began to show a disturbing new metric, a drop in conversion velocity, the speed at which a click led to a purchase or subscription, on content flagged by the plugin. Their A/B testing scrambled to find new narrative hooks that could evade the pattern detection. They tried shifting the wealthy savior to a wealthy female CEO. The plugin adapted, flagging it as a variant. They tried making the animal not disabled but elderly. It was flagged. The protocol was teaching the machine that the underlying structure, the exploitation of vulnerability for a simplified rescue fantasy, was the recognizable pattern, not the superficial details. The farms were in an arms race with a tool built from their own blueprint. This computational stalemate was overshadowed by a more profound collapse, a credibility implosion from within. The whistleblower, Algo Whisper, chose this moment to drop the final, most damaging tranche of data. It was not about audience manipulation, but about financial fraud. The internal documents revealed that several of the content farms' donation partnerships with charities were largely fictional. The promised percentages were either never paid or were cycled through shell companies, creating a paper trail of philanthropy that ultimately led back to the farm's own accounts. The live-action romance series was particularly egregious. The surprise donations filmed for the shows were often temporary, with funds requiring the shelter to meet unrealistic adoption quotas or later be repaid. The emotional climax of the video was, in several cases, a fraudulent transaction. This evidence was handed not just to journalists, but to state attorneys general and the Internal Revenue Service. The narrative machine was now facing scrutiny from entities that did not care about story arcs, only about fraud and consumer protection laws. The resulting investigations triggered a cascade. Payment processors suspended accounts. Advertising partners withdrew. The parent conglomerate, facing shareholder panic and legal liability, began to dismantle the content farm operations, scapegoating the management and shuttering the most notorious brands. The ecosystem that seemed invincible, fueled by endless emotional clicks, proved fragile when confronted with the cold logic of financial and legal accountability. In the aftermath, Maria Gonzalez's Real Garage vlog did not become a massive channel. It found its level, a sustainable, trusted source of information for a dedicated community of fosterers and adopters. The coalition shifted from emergency defense to permanent advocacy, working with animal welfare organizations to create ethical guidelines for shelter storytelling and influencer partnerships. The one-eyed kitten, as a narrative trope, did not disappear. But its appearance now often came with a whisper of awareness, a meta-commentary seeded by the very conflict. The conversation had evolved. The final, surprising detail emerged from an unlikely source: the AI models themselves. As the fraudulent content farms were dismantled, their proprietary algorithms were auctioned off to pay legal debts. A coalition of actual mental health nonprofits and educational technology groups pooled resources to acquire one of the core narrative engines. Their project, dubbed the Empathy Bridge, involved retraining the model. Instead of being fed stolen shelter posts and romance plots, it was trained on transcripts of successful conflict mediation, on stories of community cooperation, on complex narratives of healing that did not rely on a savior. The goal was to create a tool that could generate supportive, nuanced stories for therapeutic use or educational role play. The weapon was being reforged into a tool. The algorithm that learned to exploit vulnerability was being taught to model healthy resilience. This does not mean the war is over. The economic and neurological incentives that created the Mafia romance machine still exist. New content farms will emerge, exploiting new anxieties. But the battle documented here created a precedent. It proved that viral fiction, when it becomes a systemic distorting force, can be challenged. It proved that the humans behind the exploited backdrops, the shelter workers, the single mothers, could organize, hack the system, and fight back with truth and technology. It proved that even the most sophisticated manipulation engine is vulnerable when it overreaches, when it tries to trademark reality or commit fraud in the open. The story that began with an AI writing 11,000 variations ends not with the destruction of the machine, but with its repurposing. The central question posed at the outset, what happens when a culture is trained by the click, has been answered in two parts. First, it becomes vulnerable to systematic emotional exploitation. Second, if that exploitation becomes too blatant, it can generate its own antibodies. The legacy of the garage shelter, the one-eyed kitten, and the fictional mafia boss is a new layer of public literacy. A recognition that the stories we consume are not neutral, that our empathy is a resource that can be mined, and that guarding it requires vigilance, tools, and a commitment to the beautiful, frustrating complexity of the real world over the seductive simplicity of the perfect, engineered fantasy. This new awareness is the bridge to our final reckoning, to the question of what we do now, in a landscape forever changed. So what do we do now in this landscape? The machine is not gone. It has merely retreated, recalibrating in the data shadows. The neurological vulnerabilities it exploits, our hardwired empathy, our craving for resolution, our limbic system's 250 millisecond head start, are permanent features, not bugs. They are the foundation of human connection, now also the foundation of a trillion-dollar attention economy. The challenge, therefore, is not to become less human, to wall off our empathy in cynical defense. The challenge is to become more discerning, to build a new literacy that operates at the speed of the algorithm itself. This literacy has a simple first principle: pause the payoff. When a story, an image, a headline promises a perfect emotional resolution, the villain redeemed, the rescue complete, the struggle erased by wealth, that is the moment to hesitate. That is the engineered itch. Ask the machine a question it cannot answer. Ask, what is the real cost? Who is telling this story, and what do they gain from my click? What complex reality is being simplified to serve this narrative? This is not cynicism. It is the application of reason to emotion, the prefrontal cortex reasserting its partnership with the heart. The second principle is to value the unoptimized. Seek out the stories that are messy, unresolved, and devoid of a savior. Support the creators and causes that present reality in its complex, sometimes frustrating truth. The unoptimized story does not travel as far or as fast in our current ecosystem, which is precisely why it needs intentional support. Your attention is the most valuable commodity in this equation. Direct it thoughtfully. The final principle is to remember that every system is built by people and can be changed by people. The content farms, the algorithms, the engagement metrics, these are not laws of nature. They are choices, encoded in software and business models. As users, as consumers, and as citizens, we can demand different choices. We can support regulations that force transparency in targeted advertising and narrative marketing. We can champion digital literacy education that teaches not just how to use technology, but how it uses us. The story of the Mafia boss and the one-eyed kitten was never really about them. It was a mirror, reflecting our own desires and vulnerabilities back at us through a distorted, profitable lens. The fight to correct that distortion is ongoing. It happens every time you choose a deep read over a quick click, every time you donate directly to a shelter instead of buying a themed candle, every time you question why a story makes you feel the way it does. This is the new frontier of civic life, the stewardship of our own attention and empathy. It is the most personal form of resistance and the most powerful. The next time you feel that compelling click, remember, you are not just choosing a story. You are casting a vote for the kind of world you want to live in, one shaped by engineered fairy tales, or by the beautiful, difficult, and ultimately real work of human and animal connection. Thank you for watching. If you want to continue digging into the unseen systems shaping your world, consider subscribing. We'll see you in the next story.